The grand chamber of the Galactic Council stretched, wide enough to hold representatives from 47 different alien species, and each one of them sat in their designated spaces waiting for the session to begin. Ambassador Zexithar stood at the center podium, and his translucent body glowed with a soft blue light as he called everyone to attention. The chamber fell silent except for the gentle hum of translation devices that allowed all these different species to understand each other, despite speaking completely different languages. Today was supposed to be a simple day with routine matters to discuss and nothing particularly exciting on the agenda. The main item was reviewing an application from a new species that wanted to join the council, and this species called themselves humans. Zexthar looked at his datapad and began speaking in his melodic voice that the translators converted into sounds each species could understand. He explained that the humans had submitted all required documentation for council membership, and their application seemed complete in most ways. The humans came from a planet they called Earth, which orbited a yellow star in a relatively quiet part of the galaxy. They had recently developed faster-than-light travel and had been exploring nearby systems when they encountered a council patrol ship. The meeting had been peaceful, and the humans had expressed great interest in joining the galactic community. Archivist Drelnox floated forward to the podium, and his massive form cast shadows across the chamber floor. He was from a species that breathed methane instead of oxygen, and he wore a special suit that kept him comfortable in the council chambers. Drelnox had been tasked with reviewing all the documents the humans had submitted, and he had found something unusual. He explained that there seemed to be an error in the human submission, because the files labeled as cultural documentation appeared to actually contain military history instead. This caused some quiet laughter among the assembled aliens because most species in the council had not experienced war in thousands of years. High Magistrate Forlin spoke up from her seat and suggested they should review these files anyway, just to understand the humans better. She was from the Centauri Coalition, which was known throughout the galaxy as one of the most peaceful civilizations ever recorded. Her species had not experienced any form of violent conflict in over 15,000 cycles, and they viewed military history as something quaint and outdated, like studying ancient primitive customs. Several other delegates nodded in agreement, and there was a general feeling that this would be entertaining in a harmless way. Zexthar agreed and instructed Drelnox to display the files on the central holographic screens that floated above the chamber floor. The first file loaded, and its title appeared in the common galactic script after being translated from human language. It read World War II and included dates according to the human calendar system. The aliens leaned forward in their seats with mild curiosity as the images began to play. Most of them had never seen humans before, and they were curious about what this species looked like. The initial footage showed human cities with tall buildings and streets filled with vehicles. The images were in black and white, which seemed primitive compared to galactic recording technology, but the aliens found it charming in a way. Humans appeared to be bipedal creatures similar to several other species in the council, with 2 arms and 2 legs and a head on top. They seemed unremarkable at first glance, and nothing about their appearance suggested anything unusual or dangerous. Some of the younger delegates were already growing bored and checking their personal devices for more interesting matters. Then the footage changed and showed human aircraft dropping bombs on those same cities they had just been admiring. Massive explosions tore through buildings and sent debris flying in all directions. The aliens sat up straighter in their seats, and their various forms of attention focused completely on the screens. More footage followed, showing human soldiers in uniforms carrying weapons and fighting against other human soldiers who wore different uniforms. The fighting was brutal in close range, with humans shooting at each other and throwing explosive devices and charging forward with bayonets attached to their rifles. Ambassador Thelorn from the peaceful Aquari species made a sound of distress that his translator converted into words of shock and disbelief. He could not understand what he was watching because it seemed impossible that any intelligent species would fight like this. The footage continued, showing battlefields covered with dead human bodies and wounded soldiers crying out in pain. Human medics ran through gunfire to reach injured soldiers, and many of those medics were shot and killed while trying to save others. Tanks rolled across muddy fields, crushing everything in their path, while artillery shells exploded all around them. The chamber had gone completely silent now, except for the sounds coming from the historical footage. The aliens watched as humans stormed beaches under heavy machine gun fire with hundreds of them, falling dead in the water and on the sand, but thousands more kept coming. They saw footage of a city called Stalingrad, where humans fought over every single building and every single room for months in freezing winter conditions. Both sides refused to retreat, and both sides kept sending more soldiers into the meat grinder until the entire city was nothing but rubble and corpses. Zex there finally commanded the system to pause the footage because he needed a moment to process what everyone had just witnessed. His glowing form flickered with what other species recognized as severe emotional distress. He asked Drelnox how many casualties the humans had suffered in this one conflict they were watching. The archivist consulted his data files and reported that approximately 70 million humans had died during World War II, including both military personnel and civilian populations. The number hung in the air like a physical weight pressing down on everyone in the chamber. 70 million deaths in a single war was incomprehensible to most species present because many of them had total populations smaller than that number. The peaceful species like the Centauri and the Aquari had populations in the low millions across all their worlds combined. Even the larger species rarely exceeded a few 100 million individuals across their entire civilizations. The idea that one species could lose 70 million of their own kind in just 6 years of fighting was beyond their ability to fully grasp. Magistrate Vorlin asked the obvious question that everyone was thinking about: whether the human civilization had survived such devastating losses. Drelnox looked at his files again and replied that not only had humanity survived, but they had continued having more wars after this one ended. He explained that the files contained records of thousands of separate conflicts throughout human history, spanning back as far as humans had kept written records. The chamber erupted in shocked voices speaking over each other in dozens of different languages, creating a chaos of sound that the translation system struggled to handle properly. The council chamber took nearly an hour to settle back into order after the initial shock of viewing the world. War II footage, and during that time delegates from various species gathered in small groups to discuss what they had witnessed. Some species representatives were expressing doubt about whether the footage was even real, because it seemed too extreme to be actual historical records. Others were already calling for immediate rejection of the human application, without reviewing any more materials. Zexthar had to use the chamber's attention signal 3 times before everyone finally returned to their seats and quieted down enough for the session to continue. Once order was restored, Zexthar announced they would continue reviewing the human historical records to get a complete picture before making any decisions. Several delegates protested this decision, but the ambassador reminded them that council protocol required thorough review of all submitted materials before any votes could be taken. Drelnox brought up another file from the human archives, and this one was labeled World War I. The dates showed it had occurred roughly 20 years before the war they had just been watching, which meant humans had fought 2 massive global conflicts within a single generation. The footage from World War I showed a different kind of horror than what they had seen before. This war was fought primarily in long ditches called trenches that stretched across entire continents. Human soldiers lived in these muddy holes for months or years at a time, and they would occasionally climb out and charge across open ground toward enemy trenches. Machine guns would cut down hundreds or thousands of these charging soldiers within minutes, but more humans would keep coming. The aliens watched in stunned silence as wave after wave of human soldiers ran into certain death while their commanders kept ordering more attacks. Particular battle called the Somme resulted in over 1 million casualties in just a few months, and the front lines barely moved at all during that entire time. Humans were killing each other by the thousands every single day just to gain a few 100 meters of muddy ground. The footage showed new weapons that humans had invented specifically for this war, including poison gas that caused horrible suffering and death to anyone who breathed it. Tanks appeared for the first time as crude metal boxes that could cross trenches and barbed wire while firing weapons in all directions. Kren Dak spoke up from his seat, and he was a military historian from the Saurian Imperium, which was one of the few council species that still maintained any kind of defense force. He pointed out something that made the other aliens even more uncomfortable than they already were. Krendak explained that humans showed an incredible ability to adapt and innovate during warfare. He noted that in 1914, when World War I started, humans were fighting with bolt-action rifles and cavalry charges. By 1918, when it ended, they had developed tanks and military aircraft and chemical weapons and much more effective artillery. In World War II, they started with basic propeller planes and ended with jet aircraft and atomic bombs. Magistrate Forlin asked what atomic bombs were, and Drellnox pulled up footage from the end of World War II, showing 2 Japanese cities being completely destroyed by single bombs. The mushroom clouds rose kilometers into the sky, and everything beneath them was vaporized or burned beyond recognition. The estimated death toll from just these 2 bombs was over 200,000 humans killed almost instantly. The chamber fell into another shocked silence as they processed the fact that humans had created weapons capable of destroying entire cities with a single strike. Ambassador Thelorn asked why humans would create such terrible weapons and use them against their own species. Drellnox explained that according to the historical records, the humans had been fighting for 6 years already by that point, and the side that dropped the atomic bombs believed it would end the war faster and actually save lives by avoiding a ground invasion. The logic was brutal, but it made a certain terrible sense. Humans had calculated that killing 200,000 people quickly was better than losing millions more and continued fighting. Zexthar ordered more files to be displayed, and the council spent the next several hours watching humanity's blood-soaked history unfold before them. They saw the Roman Empire conquering vast territories through military might and organization. They watched the Mongol hordes sweeping across continents on horseback, leaving destroyed cities in their wake. The Crusades showed humans traveling thousands of kilometers to fight other humans over religious beliefs and control of holy sites. The Napoleonic Wars demonstrated how one brilliant human military commander could reshape an entire continent through warfare. Every conflict showed the same patterns repeating over and over again. Humans would fight with whatever technology they had available, and they would quickly develop better weapons and better tactics. They showed no hesitation about using overwhelming force when they thought it was necessary. They demonstrated a willingness to absorb terrible casualties in pursuit of their objectives. Most disturbing of all, they never seemed to learn permanent lessons from their wars because they just kept having more of them. The footage moved into more recent human history and showed conflicts in places called Korea and Vietnam. These wars were different from the massive global conflicts, but they were no less brutal in their own ways. In Vietnam, the aliens watched humans fighting in dense jungles where visibility was measured in meters. Both sides used guerrilla tactics and booby traps and ambushes. Human soldiers would patrol through swamps and forests, knowing that any step might trigger a hidden explosive device. The war dragged on for years with neither side able to gain decisive advantage, but both sides continuing to fight anyway. A junior delegate from the Metherin Scholarium nervously asked if they could see information about current human military capabilities. The question caused another wave of uneasy murmuring throughout the chamber because everyone suddenly realized they had been so focused on human history that they had not thought about what humans might be capable of in the present day. Zexthar looked troubled, but he agreed. It was a relevant question and instructed Drellnox to display current human military information. The screens changed to show orbital defense platforms surrounding Earth, and human warships patrolled nearby space. The ships bristled with weapons that the Council's analysis systems identified as railguns and missile batteries, and energy weapons and more. Planetary defense grids covered every major population center with overlapping fields of fire. Human ground forces showed advanced armor and weapons and highly trained special operations units. The military force was impressive in its scope and organization, but what truly shocked the Council was seeing that all of it was unified under a single command structure. Commander Halvex from the Korthax Defense Fleet leaned forward in his seat and pointed out what many others were thinking. After thousands of years of separate nations and tribes fighting each other, humans had finally unified their entire species under one government and one military command. They had not disarmed after achieving peace. They had not reduced their military capabilities. Instead, they had organized everything into a more efficient and more deadly force. The Earth Defense Coalition represented something the galaxy had never seen before, which was a species that had learned warfare through constant practice and then unified all that knowledge and experience into a single organization. The Galactic Council chamber remained in chaos for quite some time after, viewing the current human military capabilities, and Zexthar had given up trying to maintain order. because he understood that everyone needed time to process what they had learned. Small groups of delegates clustered together, speaking in urgent tones about what should be done. Some species representatives were demanding immediate rejection of the human application, while others argued for quarantine measures to keep humans contained in their home system. A few voices suggested that maybe rejection itself would be dangerous, and those voices were not entirely ignored. Commander, Halvex stood up from his seat and raised one of his many limbs to request permission to speak. Zexthar recognized him, and the chamber gradually fell quiet because Halvex was one of the few beings present with actual military experience. The Korthax maintained a small defense fleet, not because they expected conflict, but because they believed in being prepared for unexpected circumstances. Halvex had commanded ships in that fleet for many cycles, and his opinion carried weight on military matters, even though most council species found such matters distasteful. Halvex spoke carefully and chose his words with deliberate precision. He pointed out that the council needed to consider what message they would send by rejecting humanity's application. Humans had submitted their records honestly and answered all questions truthfully according to the reports. They had been at peace with themselves for 80 years, which might not seem like much to species that measured peace in thousands of cycles, but for humans, it represented significant progress. Most importantly, humans now had faster-than-light travel, and the Council could not prevent them from exploring the galaxy even if membership was denied. Magistrate Vorlin responded sharply that Halvex seemed to be suggesting the Council should admit humans out of fear. Her three-part harmony voice carried notes of anger and disgust as she spoke. She argued that the Council was built on principles of peace and cooperation, and admitting a species with such a violent history would compromise everything the galactic community stood for. Several other delegates voiced agreement, and the chamber seemed ready to erupt into another round of chaotic debate. Halvex remained calm and explained that he was not speaking from fear but from practical assessment of the situation. Humans had proven themselves capable of incredible violence, but they had directed that violence at each other for their entire history. They had spent 40,000 years fighting among themselves because they had no external enemies to fight. The question the Council needed to consider was what humans might do if they were rejected and isolated. What would happen if the galactic community made itself an enemy of humanity, either intentionally or through the appearance of hostility? The chamber fell silent as delegates considered this perspective. Zexthar asked Halvex to elaborate on his concerns. The commander explained that species which evolved beyond warfare typically did so because fighting became unnecessary or disadvantageous. Most council races had developed advanced technology and peaceful cooperation because those things made survival easier. But humans had developed technology and cooperation while maintaining their capacity for warfare. They had learned to work together not to avoid fighting but to fight more effectively. Zexthar requested that specific footage from the human records be displayed again. He wanted to see the Vietnam War files once more, because he had noticed something during the initial viewing. Drelnox brought up the footage and let it play while Zexthar provided commentary. He pointed out that in Vietnam humans had fought an asymmetric war, where the smaller force used unconventional tactics against the larger force. Both sides had endured conditions that would break most species mentally and physically. The fighting took place in dense jungles with limited visibility and constant danger from hidden enemies. What Zexthar wanted everyone to notice was that this was humans fighting humans. It was always humans against humans throughout their entire history. Different nations or different ideologies or different religious beliefs, but always the same species turning their violence inward. Humans had never fought an external enemy because they had never encountered another intelligent species until now. 40,000 years of conflict and innovation and adaptation had all been driven by internal competition among human groups. The ambassador let that sink in for a moment before asking the chamber to imagine what would happen if humanity suddenly had an external enemy to fight. The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop several degrees as everyone understood what Zexthar was implying. If humans could do such terrible things to each other while divided into competing groups, then what could they accomplish if they were truly unified against an outside threat? The Earth Defense Coalition showed they had already unified their military forces. If the Council rejected them and humans perceived that as hostility, there was no telling what might happen. A species that had survived 40,000 years of internal warfare might view external conflict as an opportunity rather than a deterrent. Ambassador. Thelorn spoke up in a trembling voice and suggested that perhaps the Council should learn more about human culture beyond their military history. He proposed that they review human art and philosophy and scientific achievements to get a more complete picture. Several delegates agreed this was reasonable, and Zexthar instructed Drelnox to prepare additional files about human culture for review. The archivist worked quickly and soon had several categories ready, including arts and sciences and philosophy and social development. The next several hours proved somewhat reassuring to the assembled aliens as they learned about other aspects of human civilization. Humans had created beautiful music and stunning visual art. Their literature explored complex themes of morality and existence. They had made remarkable scientific discoveries and showed great creativity in solving problems. Human philosophy included concepts of justice and mercy and compassion. Many humans throughout history had dedicated their lives to helping others and working for peace, but even the cultural files could not escape the shadow of human violence. Much of their greatest art had been created during or in response to wars. Their philosophy often grappled with questions about when violence was justified. Their social development included numerous peace movements and attempts to create international laws limiting warfare. Humans seemed acutely aware of their own capacity for violence, and many of them had worked hard to control or channel that capacity in constructive directions. Kren Dak, the military historian, provided analysis that helped put things in perspective. He noted that humans had developed complex rules about warfare, including the Geneva Conventions that established standards for treating prisoners and protecting civilians. They had created international courts to prosecute war crimes. They had organizations dedicated to mediating conflicts and preventing wars before they started. Humans understood the cost of violence perhaps better than species who had never really experienced large-scale warfare. They knew what they were capable of, and many of them were horrified by it. The debate continued for 3 full days, with delegates presenting arguments from every possible angle. Genetic specialists explained that humans were evolved persistence predators, which meant they had instincts for pursuing prey over long distances and never giving up. Psychologists discussed human tribal nature and their tendency to form groups based on shared identity. Anthropologists detailed how human culture glorified warriors and celebrated military victories throughout their history. All of this painted a picture of a species fundamentally shaped by conflict and competition. Yet other voices in the council chambers spoke in favor of humanity, and these voices grew stronger as the debate continued. Scientists pointed out that humans had made remarkable progress in space exploration and had developed advanced medical technologies. Diplomats noted that the human delegation had approached the council peacefully and had expressed genuine interest in cooperation rather than conquest. Philosophers discussed human concepts of sacrifice and duty, and how many humans were willing to risk their lives to protect others. The picture that emerged was complex and contradictory, which seemed to be the essence of humanity itself. On the morning of the 4th day, Zexthar called for final statements before the vote would be taken. Representatives from various species took turns expressing their positions, and the chamber listened with the exhausted patience of those who had argued themselves into circles. Magistrate Vorlin maintained her position that humanity was too dangerous and too violent to be trusted with council membership. She argued that 80 years of peace was nothing compared to the 40,000 years of warfare that preceded it. Her speech was passionate, and several delegates nodded in agreement. Commander Halvex gave the counter-argument and spoke about practical realities rather than idealistic principles. He acknowledged that humans were dangerous, but pointed out that dangerous and hostile were not the same thing. Humans had submitted their application voluntarily and had been honest about their history. They were already in space and already exploring. The choice was not whether to interact with humans, but how to interact with them. Membership with oversight was safer than rejection and isolation. Several smaller species delegates spoke about their fears of what humanity might do. The Metheran representative worried that humans would dominate council politics through intimidation. The Aquari delegate expressed concern that human military culture would corrupt the peaceful nature of galactic civilization. Others worried about humans spreading their violent tendencies to younger species who might see warfare as an acceptable solution to problems. These fears were not unreasonable given what everyone had learned over the past few days. But then something unexpected happened when a delegate from the Zentari Communion requested permission to speak. The Zentari were known for their analytical minds and their ability to process information without emotional bias. Their representative had remained silent throughout most of the debate, but now she stood and addressed the chamber in her species' characteristic methodical manner. She presented a statistical analysis that her team had prepared using all available human data. The Zentari analysis showed that human conflict had been declining in both frequency and intensity over the past several centuries. As humans developed better communication technology and formed larger political unions, the rate of warfare had decreased. The bloodiest conflicts in human history had occurred during periods of rapid technological change and ideological competition. But in recent centuries, humans had created international organizations and developed economic interdependence that made war less appealing. The 80 years of relative peace was not an aberration but part of a longer trend toward stability. Furthermore, the Zentari analysis indicated that human psychology might actually make them valuable council members. Humans had evolved to form strong social bonds and to work together in groups. Their capacity for empathy extended beyond their own species, as evidenced by their treatment of animals and their environmental protection efforts. Humans who had served in wars often became the strongest advocates for peace because they understood the true cost. The species that knew warfare best might be the species most committed to avoiding it. This perspective shifted the mood in the chamber somewhat. Delegates who had been firmly opposed to human membership began to reconsider. Others who had been undecided found themselves swaying toward acceptance. The debate had reached a point where everyone was simply tired and wanted resolution. Zexthar sensed this and decided it was time to move forward with the vote. He explained that the vote would determine not just whether humans could join, but under what conditions. The proposal that Zexthar put forward included several restrictions designed to address the Council's concerns. Human military forces would be integrated into the Galactic Defense Fleet under Council oversight. Human weapons development would be transparent and subject to review by Council monitors. Humanity would be required to assign a permanent military liaison to the Council, who would attend all sessions and answer questions about human defense capabilities. If humans agreed to these terms, they could become provisional members with full membership possible after a period of successful cooperation. Each delegate had time to consider the proposal and register their vote. Through the secure council system, the chamber fell silent except for the soft sounds of various species breathing, or whatever their equivalent biological process happened to be. Some delegates voted quickly, while others took longer to make their decision. The vote counting system worked in real time, but the results would not be displayed until every delegate had registered their choice. The process took almost an hour because some species required consultation with their home governments before casting votes on major decisions. Finally, the last vote was registered, and Zexthar activated the display showing the results. The chamber held its collective breath as numbers appeared on the holographic screens. The vote was closer than anyone had expected, with the margin being quite narrow. But the outcome was clear. A majority of delegates had voted in favor of conditional membership for humanity. The proposal had passed by a slim margin, but it had passed. Humans would be invited to join the Galactic Council subject to the restrictions that had been outlined. Magistrate Vorlin stood and formally registered her objection for the record. She wanted it known that her species believed this was a dangerous mistake, and she hoped the Council would not regret the decision. Several other delegates who had voted against the measure added their own objections, but the vote was final and binding according to Council law. Zexthar acknowledged the objections and assured everyone that the situation would be carefully monitored. If humans violated the terms of their membership or showed hostile intent, the matter could be brought before the Council again. Drell Knox was instructed to send the official notification to the human delegation informing them of the decision. The message would explain the terms of conditional membership and request that humans assign their military liaison as soon as possible. The formal acceptance ceremony would be scheduled for 2 months later, to allow time for humans to review the terms and for the Council to prepare appropriate protocols. Many delegates left the chamber immediately after the vote, feeling exhausted from days of intense debate. Others remained to discuss the implications in small groups. Zexthar stayed at the central podium reviewing the vote breakdown and considering what the decision might mean for the future of the Council. He had pushed for acceptance because he believed it was the practical choice, but he could not shake a feeling of uncertainty. Humans were unlike any species the Council had dealt with before. Their capacity for both violence and compassion was extreme in ways that peaceful species found difficult to understand. The coming years would reveal whether the Council had made the right choice. 2 months passed quickly as both sides prepared for the formal ceremony. The Council made arrangements to accommodate human physiology, including oxygen atmosphere and appropriate seating. Security protocols were reviewed multiple times because some delegates remained nervous about having humans in the chamber. The human delegation worked with Council staff to ensure everything would proceed smoothly. Regular communications between Earth and the Council helped build familiarity and reduce tension somewhat. The day of the formal ceremony arrived and Captain Daniel Hayes stood in the waiting area outside the Council chamber wearing his dress uniform. He had been chosen as humanity's military liaison after careful consideration by Earth's leadership. Hayes was a decorated combat veteran who had served in several peacekeeping operations and anti-piracy missions. His experience included both fighting and diplomacy, which made him ideal for this role. More importantly, he had a calm demeanor and an ability to remain professional under pressure. He would need both qualities when facing a chamber full of aliens who viewed his species with fear and suspicion. Hayes entered the Council chamber when summoned and walked steadily toward the central podium where Zexathar waited. The human noticed how quiet the chamber had become as all attention focused on him. Dozens of alien species watched him with various sensory organs, and he could feel the tension in the recycled air. He had reviewed all the footage the Council had seen, and he understood exactly why they were afraid. Humans had earned their reputation through 40,000 years of bloody history. Now he had to show them that humanity could be more than their violent past. Zexathar spoke formally welcoming Captain Hayes and humanity to provisional membership in the Galactic Council. The ambassador outlined the terms once again, making sure everything was clear and documented. Human military forces would integrate with the Galactic Defense Fleet. Human weapons development would be transparent. Captain Hayes would serve as the permanent liaison and would attend all council sessions. If humans accepted these terms, they could begin the process of full integration into the galactic community. Hayes stood at attention and responded in a clear voice that carried throughout the chamber. He stated that humanity accepted all terms and conditions as outlined. Earth's government had reviewed everything carefully and agreed that the restrictions were reasonable given the circumstances. Humans understood the Council's concerns and were willing to prove themselves trustworthy through actions rather than just words. But Hayes also wanted to address something that he felt was important for the Council to understand about his species. The captain requested permission to upload additional files to the central display system. Zexathar looked surprised but granted the request after a moment's hesitation. Hayes activated his data device and transferred files he had prepared during the 2 months of waiting. New images began appearing on the holographic screens throughout the chamber. These images showed different aspects of humanity than what the Council had seen in the war records. The first images showed field hospitals from various human wars, where soldiers treated wounded enemies alongside their own injured comrades. Hayes explained that humans had developed rules of warfare that required medical care for all wounded regardless of which side they fought for. Medics wore special markings that identified them as non-combatants, and attacking medical personnel was considered a war crime. Even in the midst of terrible violence, humans had created systems to reduce suffering where possible. More images followed showing reconstruction efforts after wars ended. Germans and Americans who had fought each other became allies and friends. Japanese cities destroyed by atomic bombs were rebuilt with help from the same nation that had dropped those bombs. Former enemies worked together to create lasting peace. Hayes pointed out that humans understood something important about conflict, which was that wars eventually end and former enemies must find ways to live together. Afterward, the displays showed footage of the Nuremberg trials where humans had prosecuted their own leaders for war crimes. Hayes explained that humans had created international laws about acceptable conduct in warfare. Soldiers who committed atrocities could be held accountable even if they were following orders. This showed that humans recognized moral limits even during armed conflict. They had struggled throughout their history to balance military necessity with ethical behavior. Hayes continued by showing the Council footage of Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, where humans from opposing sides of Conflicts met to discuss what had happened and work toward healing. Veterans who had tried to kill each other decades earlier now sat together sharing their experiences and their trauma. Humans who had committed terrible acts during wars faced their victims and sought forgiveness. The process was painful, but it represented humanity's attempt to move beyond cycles of violence and revenge. The captain paused and looked around the chamber, making eye contact with as many delegates as his human vision allowed. He acknowledged that yes, humanity had a violent history, and yes, humans were capable of terrible things. But every war humans fought had taught them lessons about the cost of violence. They had learned mercy on battlefields where mercy seemed impossible. They had learned compassion in the aftermath of destruction. They had learned that peace was not simply the absence of conflict, but an active choice to resolve differences without bloodshed. Hayes explained that humans were warriors, but they were also healers. They were destroyers, but they were also builders. They had done terrible things, but they had also shown that even the most violent species could choose peace. Not because humans were weak, but because they understood the true cost of war better than species who had abandoned conflict thousands of years ago without ever really experiencing its full horror. Every human soldier who returned from combat carried memories that would haunt them forever. Every human society that rebuilt after war knew the price they had paid. The captain shared a saying that was common among human military personnel. The best warrior is not the one who fights, but the one who makes fighting unnecessary. Humans came to the council not seeking war, but offering their experience in preventing it. Because if there was one thing humanity had learned through 40,000 years of conflict, it was that peace was always worth fighting for. The phrase seemed contradictory, but it captured something essential about the human perspective on violence and security. Hayes concluded by stating that humans were not asking the council to ignore their history or to pretend they were something they were not. Humans acknowledged their capacity for violence, and they took responsibility for their past. But they were also offering something valuable, which was their understanding of conflict and their commitment to peace based on hard experience. Humans would serve the council faithfully and would prove through their actions that the trust being placed in them was justified. Zek's form pulsed with something that might have been respect as he responded to Hayes. The ambassador formally welcomed humanity to the Galactic Council and expressed hope that this would be the beginning of a long and productive relationship. Several delegates who had voted against human membership still looked skeptical, but others seemed more at ease after hearing Hayes speak. The ceremony concluded with traditional protocols, and Hayes took his designated seat in the chamber as humanity's official representative. The following 3 years passed with humans, gradually integrating into galactic society. Human ships joined council patrols and human engineers shared their technology. Captain Hayes attended every council session and patiently answered countless questions about human culture and capabilities. Some species remained wary, but most began to accept that humans were genuinely committed to peace. Trade agreements were established and scientific collaborations began producing interesting results. Everything seemed to be progressing well. Then long-range sensors detected something emerging from dark space at the edge of explored territory. The signals were unusual, and council scientists worked to analyze the data. Within days, the truth became clear. An hostile alien swarm called the Kresh was moving toward council space. Early reports suggested they were a hive mind species that consumed resources from every world they encountered. Preliminary analysis indicated the Kresh had destroyed several civilizations already and showed no interest in communication or negotiation.